Hi everyone, and welcome to episode number 4 of CS888. This is actually going to be our last of my official episodes, but of course there's still lots more content to cover. So on today's episode, before we actually get into things, we're going to actually be talking about stereo 3D perception and applications of stereo 3D. But as I said, before we get into that, there's a few things that I wanted to mention first. First off, I apologize for the delay in getting to grading the second round of presentations. I'm about a third of the way through, and hopefully I will be finished that by the end of the week. I do apologize for the delay. One of the other things that I wanted to mention to you is that participation is actually a part of your marks. So please, even if you are not a presenter, please make sure that you watch the videos that are there and ask questions on Piazza. That's the only real way we have to mark participation, right? The other thing I wanted to say is, for those of you that missed our guest speaker last week, Director Jonathan Keatson, I will be posting a edited version of the talk probably in a week or so, and I do apologize for the delay for this. For those of you who were able to watch the live talk, as I'm sure you noticed, John is quite a colorful character, so I do need to edit out some of the perhaps inappropriate bits. But we will get that posted for those of you that missed it. The other thing I wanted to say is that if you haven't had an opportunity to submit your project proposal, I know it's past the deadline, but please do still submit it, because I want to make sure that you're going down a path that is achievable for the amount of time that you have left. And on the note of the final projects, I've discussed personally with a few of you about the importance of actually running whatever algorithm you're doing on some real stereo content. So I know that content from the Kitty dataset or the Middlebury dataset, it's real stereo data, but it's also a bit contrived in the sense that it was produced specifically for those purposes, and they were trying to extract the most perfect disparity maps that they could, and the subjects themselves are not that interesting, and you don't have to worry about rectification or focal differences between the two images and so on and so forth. So I want to say they're too easy to work with. So definitely build your algorithm using the Kitty and the Middlebury datasets, because that's going to make sure that your algorithm actually behaves the way you anticipate it will. And it also gives you a mechanism for comparing your results to other previous work results. But please make sure at the end you actually run your algorithm on just random 3D photos. And to that effect, I'm actually going to be uploading a series of stereo photos that I actually took, I think in 2011. They're terrible, because I didn't know what I was doing. And they have my finger probably in half of them. But that will make them more interesting, because all of these algorithms, we're developing them for the perfect photos. But your average user is not perfect. And so it's important to understand how these methods actually work for imperfect photos. So I'll post a link to those on Piazza over the next week. And you're welcome to edit these photos however you want, of course, to make them work, because some of them have some pretty bad errors in them. Now, for editing your stereo photos, if you need to do any rectification or adjustments of the screen plane, I highly recommend the application Stereo Photo Maker, which I've posted a link on Piazza. It works pretty well in Linux and Windows. It doesn't work very well in Catalina because it's a 32-bit application. You can run the Windows 64-bit application using Wine64 on Catalina, but there are some serious bugs, so you can't create a wigglegram. It actually crashes the program. And I haven't checked to see if they fixed that in the last few weeks. But yes, Stereo Photo Maker is a really great tool to help you adjust any photos that you need. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, I'm going to bring this up here on my computer and I'll show you. For anyone who is working with computing disparity, not from 2D, but from a 3D image. Let me switch over here so you can see this. If you're on the Middlebury website, and I have a link to this actually posted on Piazza, there is this Middlebury stereo evaluation. Now, this is actually, this is really neat. So anyone who's creating algorithms to produce a disparity map, they run Middlebury's evaluation, and then you get your score posted against all of the other scores out there. So if you're one of those projects that's interested in producing disparity maps from 3D images, I highly recommend that you look into this Middlebury stereo evaluation and make sure that you run your method through it so that you have a means for comparing your method against a much larger number of other methods that exist. And all of the details for running the Middlebury stereo evaluation are obviously on the website. So there's code, there's submit or evaluate your own results. And there's an older version of this as well, which is no longer active, but you could use that as well if you wanted. All right, so I think with that then, that's all of the things that I wanted to announce. So let's actually start talking about then the topic of the day, which is stereo 3D perception and the applications of it. So for this part of the course, we're not so much talking about how do we produce the 3D content. We're not talking about how do we produce disparity maps. We're not even interested in how do we correct mistakes made or stylize the stereo content. We're going to take the assumption at this point that we already know how to create the stereo content, we know how to manipulate the stereo content, and we can assume that it works pretty well. We don't need to make any accommodations for, mistakes and so on. So now what we want to talk about, so how is this stereo 3D content, now that we have it, how can we use it? And how do people perceive its use, where it is used currently? And aside from film, where I've kind of focusing, what are some other applications that the stereo 3D has? And of all of these algorithms that we've been looking at, is there any other places aside from film where these could be used, which would be very valuable in the future? So what I want to do, and this is probably going to be a bit of a shorter episode here, is I want to start by talking about stereo 3D in film. And some of the topics we're going to retouch on here were mentioned by the guest speaker Davis, but we're going to go into a little bit deeper on some of them here. So first off is when we're talking about film, why do we do stereo 3D? And the biggest reason we use stereo 3D is money. What goes on through the film industry is they want to bring people into the theaters so that they can make money. And this actually happened right around, a lot of innovation with film actually happened right around the end of World War II, or late 1940s, early 1950s. What happened was, leading up to the war, people actually went to the theater a lot because they didn't have televisions in their home. And after the war, televisions actually started to be a thing throughout the early 50s, well, throughout the 50s. And so people didn't really feel a need to go into the theaters to watch a movie because they could watch content from the comfort of their home. And how nice is that? Being able to sit in the comfort of your home with your family and your friends and watch whatever you want. You don't have to get dressed. You don't have to pay any extra money. You can have your own popcorn, all of those things. So the film industry was trying to figure out, how do we draw the audience from their home TVs back into the theaters? And in order to do that, we've got to give them an experience that they can't get at home. And so they started to bring in things like color and widescreen projection, and stereo 3D made a return during this as one of these mechanisms to try to draw audiences back into the theaters. And it would be remiss of me to say that that's not part of the reason why we're doing it again right now. Why have people been bringing 3D films to market since about 2009? It's because it helps draw audiences into the theaters. It gives us an experience that we can't quite get at home. And I do know that stereo 3D TVs were a thing. You can't really buy them anymore. But that home 3D experience didn't really pan out for a variety of reasons. One of them being that the glasses were really expensive and they're very fragile, and nobody actually wants to have to deal with putting on a pair of glasses in the comfort of your own home. So 3D for a lot of this is actually about money. It's also about being able to distribute the film in markets that you wouldn't be otherwise able to distribute it in. So Davis talked about how when they want to distribute movies to China, there's a limited number of movies that can actually penetrate that market. And one of the ways to help enter the market there is to actually have the movie 3D, because some markets are way more interested in 3D than we are. I would actually argue that North America is actually quite hostile to stereo 3D, whereas Europe and Asia love it. Like, they love it, they love 3D research, whereas in North America, it tends to be a little bit more of a hostile environment. So 3D gives you more money and gives you the ability, of course, to penetrate markets which might be difficult to penetrate otherwise. So that is one of the big driving factors. But there are some other reasons why you might actually produce a stereo 3D story. And John kind of touched on this, but one of the things that you might do, reason why you might have 3D, is because you want to create a more engaging experience. There's this thing called suspension of disbelief. It's where you kind of create this world, and it's so engaging and so rich that you can look beyond the fact that it's not real, and you become a part of it. So we've suspended your disbelief of the world. And by the way, this is a screenshot from Avatar 2. It's fresh. It's a very fresh screenshot, very recently released. So, I mean, this is a classic example of a world that somebody has created to suspend your disbelief, because you're going to see this world and it's so rich. And it's not just the visual beauty of it, but it's how the story is told. It suspends your disbelief. And stereo 3D can actually contribute to that. It can draw you in and make you feel more a part of this artificial world than just a standard 2D film. And we can also use 3D to help with the emotional story. So I linked a video called Chiral Eyes, which if you actually try to watch in 3D might be very, very uncomfortable, because the left and right eye are actually seeing different pictures. But the way the 3D was used there was actually drawing you into an emotional story. So 3D does have reasons to be used other than just money. And I mean, there's some cool other emotional effects that you can create with it. You can imagine that if you wanted to give people the sensation that they are falling in a film, 3D is a really good tool to do that, because you can create a very deep world, and then you can drop them virtually into it, and they can actually feel that bit of nausea. If you want to have them do loop-de-loops and make them feel like they are actually getting seasick, you can do that with 3D. Not to say people have, or you necessarily should do a lot of this in a film, but 3D does give us the technical ability to create more of an emotional and physical response in the viewer than a standard 2D film would. And if you actually look at one of the places where stereo 3D has actually done pretty well is actually in theme parks. Now, I'm not a theme park person. I don't really find it that exciting, but you can go on these rides where you go into like a theater and like the seats move, but you're actually watching like a 3D scene from like a movie or something. So that's actually a place where 3D has been used for many, many years and is still used today. So now let's talk about the reality of the situation. So we've talked a lot about how stereo 3D mistakes can cause discomfort. So we've talked about things how if you have too much depth, if you have too little depth, if you have inconsistencies between the left and right views, like things that should fuse but can't fuse because the color is different, or there is artifacts in one image that aren't in another, and so on and so forth. All of those things can cause visual discomfort. Let's pretend we now have 3D content that is technically perfect. And in reality, what's interesting is you go into a theater, and even if the content itself is technically perfect, you still may experience a lot of discomfort. And what's really interesting about this is it actually comes down to stereo content, even if technically perfect, was really only meant to be viewed from a very small spot in space. So if you were to actually look at a layout of a theater, and each film is going to be different because the range of depth is different, the best viewing position is going to be different based on the content and how they've set it up and so on and so forth, and it's going to vary based on theater. But there is actually in a theater a sweet spot. And it's usually roughly the middle of the theater, such that you are looking straight at the center of the screen. And if you're in that position, you are going to get the best 3D viewing experience. Whereas if you're one of the people on the side of the theater, you're not going to get the same viewing experience as the person in the middle, because you are watching content that was meant to be viewed straight on, but you're not straight on. You're over to the side. And because you're over to the side, your brain is expecting that the content you'll be seeing is around to the left a little bit, but you're not. So you're not getting that same stereo viewing experience that the people in the middle. And this can actually cause a lot of viewing discomfort. So that's one of the reasons why even if we have perfect content and we view it in the theater, we may still experience discomfort. But there's one reason that we haven't talked about really. And it's something that doesn't have to do with, mistakes. It has something to do with something even older. So I want to stop talking about 3D for a minute, and what I want to talk about now is I want to talk about how we make a traditional 2D film. So if you were to make a 2D film, or let's just suppose you were to watch a regular movie. If you look at a movie, it's divided into scenes. Now each scene is addressing a particular topic. So we might have a scene where all of the Avengers are gathered together and they are having a conversation about how are they going to find Thanos. And then they'll have another scene right beside this, and the scene beside this is going to be them going off to find Thanos. Those are two separate scenes. And your film is made up of, it depends on the film, but you may have hundreds of scenes, or you may have very few scenes. Each scene is further subdivided into really short things called shots. And a shot is just a single camera take. So, for example, you are looking at a picture of me on your screen right now. This is one shot. I don't have a bunch of little pieces that I'm editing together because I don't edit these. These are done live. So these are singular shots. But if you look at a scene is a bunch of shots that are glued together in a specific way. Now, it may not be obvious to you what that specific way is, but there is a specific way they are glued together. And it's very important that those shots are put in a specific order. Now, to kind of explain this, I want to show you something called the Kuleshov effect. Now, this is not the original images used from the Kuleshov experiment, which was done quite a long time ago in the Soviet Russia by Kuleshov. But the original images I find a little creepy because they've got like a child in a coffin, so I decided to use these ones from Hitchcock instead. So back a long time ago, people realized that in order to tell a story, it's not just about what the actors are saying and what they are doing, it's how you piece the shots together. How you piece those shots together tells a visual story, a story that is understood even if you mute the audio channel. That's very interesting. So in Soviet Russia, who actually did a lot of film research throughout the early 1900s and the 40s and the 50s. They wanted to do an experiment with Soviet montage, which is another name for how we glue these shots together, to see what kind of an emotional effect does the arrangement of shots have on an audience. So in the original experiment, they did 3 combinations of still images. They did one where it was a man, just a picture of a man's face, followed by a picture of a woman, and then the man's face. And then they did another one where instead of a woman, it was a bowl of soup, and the third one was a child in a coffin. And they asked the audience, after viewing each of these sequences of images, tell me what was going on. What was the man feeling? They were asking the audience, what was the story here? So for the story with the sequence of images that they had the woman, they said, oh, the man is looking at this woman and he feels a lot of lust because she's very beautiful and he wants to go and be with this woman. And then for the bowl of soup, they said the man was very, very hungry and presented with the soup. It made him feel very hungry. He ate the soup and then he didn't feel hungry anymore. And then for the child in the coffin, the man was very sad and shocked. Now, what was interesting about this experiment, and what the audience wasn't aware, is that the photo of the man in each of the image sequences was the same. It was the exact same photo. And not only that, the photo of the man they used before what he was looking at, and the photo after was also the same. And it was simply the juxtaposition of these images beside each other told a visual story. And you can actually see it here. So I chose to use this one with Hitchcock. And so you can actually look here. You see this photo of Hitchcock is the same as the one below, and it's the same as the 2 at the end. So we have the top row, we have Hitchcock is looking at a mother and a child, and in the bottom one, he's looking at this lady in a swimsuit. And if you didn't know that these were the same images, most people interpret the top row as, oh, look at that happy family man that Hitchcock is. Oh, he's such a nice guy. Approving of, oh, nice mommy and baby. And then they interpret the bottom one as dirty old man Hitchcock staring at a woman sunbathing out in Central Park. So it's really interesting how these sequences of images can elicit that response within us. And this is actually something that's pretty, we've been doing this for so long with film that it almost seems second nature. As you arrange the shots in such a way that they are telling a visual story. Next time you watch a movie, watch how they film a conversation. You'll start with a wide shot where you'll see, the setting, and you'll see the group of people that are conversing. And then they might go into a less wide shot where you've got just the 2 people who are going to speak. And then as the 2 individuals start to speak, the person who is speaking it'll be a close-up shot usually of just them. And then as the other person speaks, we'll move to a shot where they are speaking. And the 2 speakers will be on opposite sides of the screen. And each time person A speaks, they will always be on the same side of the screen. That arrangement is telling us who, what, why. All of those questions are being answered visually due to the arrangement of these shots. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that you might be wondering, well, how much does this really matter? It matters a lot. So this has many names. This arrangement of shots is known as film language or continuity editing or the grammar of film language. And this here is actually an image from David Aragon's book on the grammar of film language. And what it is showing you is the placement of the cameras
for each of the types of shots. So this is actually conversation. So you've got your wide shot, which is going to be camera 1 here, and that's showing you the setting. It's a conference. And then you can see on cameras 2 and 3, they are focusing on the individuals who are going to be speaking. And if we were to go back between camera A and camera B, we would always have this guy with the white jacket always on the left side of the screen, and the guy in the black shirt always on the right side of the screen. Because this is, if we switched it up, if all of a sudden in the next shot, the guy in the white jacket was on the right side of the screen, we would interpret that as something happened. We missed part of the story because the guy moved from the left of the screen to the right of the screen. It would be a discontinuous scene, and we wouldn't understand completely what's going on. We probably wouldn't be able to tell you why we felt confused by the scene, but that is why we would be confused, because one of the characters would appear to have moved, and there was no reason for that character to have moved, and it seems very confusing. It breaks the visual story, it breaks the continuity. So this concept, these arrangements of shots, have actually developed into a very natural language over the last 100 years. And if you look at any film, they follow these rules. So I'll post a link to the book, by the way, on Piazza if you're curious to see some of the other rules. Now, the book is obviously very much incomplete. It was an attempt to write down some of the main themes and ideas behind the grammar of film language, but it is very, very much not something that is written down. This is just, there are some basic rules about direction of flow, positioning of characters to make sure that the visual story is being told and not being broken for mystery reasons. And there are movies out there, by the way, which break it. So, and not because they wanted to break it, because they were just not done by people who are very good with this. And especially amateur filmmakers, they don't know what they're doing because they probably don't even know this is happening. But it does matter. Because not only does it affect, as the Kuleshov experiment showed, not only does it impact emotional state, but it actually impacts your understanding of the story. So that's this concept of film language. That is how we assemble a film into a story, so that you have not only the auditory component, but you also have this visual component that's telling the story as well. So the question is, does this work in 3D? Now, what's interesting about 3D is that in addition to positions of cameras, lenses, and how the subject is framed, 3D adds this extra dimension. It adds depth. And people have actually tried to build this thing called a depth script, which you've heard myself and Davis actually talk about. And this is actually a depth script down here at the bottom. And what you're seeing is how much parallax is being offered. You're seeing the red is going to be how much parallax the character is going to have. You're going to see the yellow is the near, so what's closest to you. Blue is how far away. And then we've got where is the sky. The pluses are where are cuts and things like that. So this is a depth script that's saying how much depth and where is the depth going to be for each of the shots. So these are additional parameters that we are adding into our world. And the question is, how do they combine with the existing tools that we have to create film language? So this is where things get really unknown. We have a pretty good understanding, or at least we know that film language for 2D is effective. The Kuleshov experiment has been repeated by many other researchers to the same effect. What we haven't really done, however, is look at the effects of discontinuities in film language. And we certainly haven't looked at how does changing depth from shot to shot impact the user's understanding of the visual story. So there is a belief out there, and I'm one of these people that believe this, that this idea of a depth script where we're trying to use depth to create an emotional story may not be the most natural or comfortable thing to do. Now, it certainly has been used effectively. I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying that there are good uses and there are some very bad uses. So here's an example of where a depth script, where we are playing with depth as part of the visual story, is a good thing, and it actually does what we want it to do and becomes a part of the visual story. So if you've seen The Wizard of Oz, there was a more recent one with James Franco. I don't remember what it was called. But Wizard of Oz starts out in a kind of sepia-toned, old-timey, standard definition world, and it is colorless and no depth. And then when you go into the fantasy world, you expand the screen into widescreen, it goes into brilliant color, and suddenly we get depth again. That is something that makes sense from telling a story perspective. That's a good way of using a depth script, because we're going from our flat, boring, everyday lives into this rich, fantastical world. Going from no depth to suddenly depth helps us with that transition from bland, boring, everyday to fantasy. That makes sense. Later on in that film, however, and I'm not sure if it was the one with James Franco or if it was the conversion of the original Wizard of Oz, I think it was the conversion, they do something that I don't agree with. They manipulate the depth of the shot to try to create story, an emotional response in other ways. And they do it in such a way that it, I feel, is discontinuous. It doesn't make sense. So what I mean here is you can imagine it as, imagine Dorothy is, you're looking at her face in one shot, and it looks like a regular round face. And then they show the Wicked Witch burning, throwing fireballs at you from the roof, and then they show this shot of Dorothy again. But this time when you look at Dorothy, maybe her face is flatter because you're trying to show fear or terror. And I understand the reasoning of why they did this. But the question is, will the audience perceive that the way that the editor was wanting? Or is the audience simply going to be wondering, there's something weird about Dorothy? She went from, and they may not even understand what's weird about it, but faces, when we are watching the 3D world, it doesn't, if I'm looking at you, your face doesn't suddenly go from round to flat back to round again. It stays the same level of roundness each time I look at you. So I think a depth script can be used as part of film language, but I don't think we yet understand how to use it properly, how to be consistent and not add confusion. So this is a very interesting bit of research in the perception of how we are using 3D. There's not a lot of work done in this area right now, by the way. All right. So this is actually, when we go to from 2D to 3D content, this additional parameter of depth, this is one way that we may be getting some discomfort. There's one other way we may be getting discomfort, and that is this question of, do these shots actually work in 3D the same way they work in 2D? In 2D, when we have this arrangement of shots, the director is leading your eyes towards the important visual elements of the scene. They're saying, focus on this person. Here's the world, so you know where you are. Okay, now focus on this person. Now focus on this person. We are leading you to focus on the important parts of the story. Now add depth. Now give people the sense of the face is round. Now have the world, let's say you're watching Avatar where the world tends to be in focus. You've got a rich fantasy 3D world. Does the film language work the way that it worked in 2D?
We don't know this. There's a good number of people who believe that it doesn't work quite as well in 3D as it works in 2D. This is actually going to be the subject of some upcoming research I want to do. But I want to do eye tracking to actually follow people watching 2D versus 3D movies and see, do people have the same focus in the same parts of the shot as they would between the same film, 2D versus 3D. The belief, by the way, is that when you present the viewer with a 3D shot, yes, they will spend time looking at the focal point, but they will probably spend less time looking at the point where the director wants you to focus, because now they have a whole 3D world that they want to focus on. And so the question is, does some of that visual story get lost because the viewer wants to explore the rich 3D world you've created? And if the answer is yes, how does that impact their understanding of the story? Are they as engaged with the story as they would be without 3D? And then if they aren't, is there something that we can do, some new film language constructs we can introduce to bring the viewers back into the story again? So there's some really interesting stuff with film language and 3D that we don't know, and we need to find the answers to. Now, just as an interesting extension on this, for those of you who are interested in virtual reality, this problem of film language and depth script is actually also a problem for VR. And it's actually more of a problem because with 3D, you are sitting down, you have a limited amount of direction that you can move and explore the 3D space. But with VR, you may actually be able to walk around in the movie. You may be able to look around things and actually walk around in the action. And the question is, does that make sense for our traditional way of storytelling? Or for VR, do these concepts of film language, do they completely break down? I do believe, by the way, that in a large part, they completely break down, and we've got to rethink how do you tell a story in VR and get that same experience that you might get in a 2D film. So this is a very interesting thing to explore in the perception of 3D. All right. By the way, I think there was a couple papers about talking about film language in 3D film. There's very little. There are some directors who have actually written like books on using film language with 3D, but I really feel like they have actually, they're just going on their gut instinct. They haven't, or how they felt it should be filmed, and I don't really feel like there's been any actual participant studies to observe what is actually happening. How are we actually perceiving the 3D and how it's used in films? So interesting stuff to look at. All right, another big use of 3D, stereo 3D, is video games. And this is actually, a lot of big gamers are really big on playing their games not just on a big screen, but playing it in stereo 3D. This, by the way, is a screenshot from Unreal Tournament, which is one of my favorite games. So what's interesting is stereo 3D for video games is actually really easy. So you've got a 3D world, it's being rendered on the fly. So from a technical perspective, offering stereo 3D for a video game is really easy. All we have to do is add another camera in or support the ability to have two cameras. Many video games already support this. And voila, you've got a left and the right view. There's no concept of a depth script going on here because you just have a 3D world that is being rendered once for the left eye and once for the right eye. So we're not dealing with any manipulations. We're not really dealing with a lot of film language here. We're dealing a lot, I want to say it's almost more real, or more like reality. This is actually a screenshot from Unreal Engine 5, by the way, which is, oh, that looks like a really nice engine. So technically speaking, doing stereo 3D for games is actually quite simple. It's quite straightforward from a technical perspective.
some film language is used in games to help tell stories, but if you're looking at something like a first-person shooter, you're not going to see anything like that. The other interesting thing about having stereo 3D for video games is that you tend to be able to adjust it to your personal level of comfort. So if you want more depth because you can handle more depth or you have better screens, then you can usually adjust it. And if you want less, you can also adjust that as well. And you don't have to worry about sitting in the optimal seat because you don't play video games sitting to the side of the game console. You usually play a video game sitting in front of it. So some interesting questions to ask about how stereo 3D is used in video games is it actually improving the player's visual experience? And do they feel like it looks better? Is it creating a better suspension of disbelief or a better engagement in the game? And another interesting question is, does adding S3D to games give the user an advantage in playing the game? So there's a few papers actually in this section that actually deal with some of these topics with varying results on conclusions. So does it improve the visual experience? The studies generally found that participants say yes, it did improve their visual experience. Whether that was because they felt they were more engaged in the game or not, that's up to you to kind of interpret. I do believe that adding stereo 3D to video games does give you a better sense of user engagement because you kind of feel like you can move your head around a little bit. You feel like you're actually in that more 3D world. Now, of course, I'm stereo blind, so I don't know. So I'm just kind of imagining what it would feel like. Now, the question of, does it give the player an advantage in the game? So you can imagine in a first-person shooter game, if you had stereo 3D and you could see just a little bit behind the pillar, does that give you an advantage in actually being able to, number one, shoot your enemy or avoid attacks from an enemy? The study that actually followed this, it wasn't clear. They didn't really find anything that suggested that it did give them an advantage or that it didn't give an advantage. And I think a lot of that actually had to do with the way the game was set up. I think a lot of the participants hadn't played the games before and may have been stumbling over simply how do you play some of these bigger games. It would be interesting to do a much larger study with something like a first-person shooter where people are going to play for longer periods of time to actually see, does it give users an advantage? I don't know the answer. So stereo 3D for video games, that is an area where people are definitely interested in looking more about what are the effects of it. Another place where we are actually seeing stereo 3D used a lot more is medical applications. So if you're looking at the medical industry, and especially for training purposes, you will see what's being used more and more is virtual reality and 3D training simulators. Because if you're trying to train somebody to be a brain surgeon, you don't want to put them in a surgery and actually have them perform brain surgery on somebody until they actually have a lot of experience with all of the different situations that might occur. So we can now, with video games being able to produce such realistic quality graphics, we can go into Unreal, we can create a 3D patient, we can give them various, anomalies in their brain, or maybe it's heart surgery. We can create an artificial problem in this artificial body, and then we can have the trainee doctors actually go in and perform a fake surgery on this fake patient. But you don't want that experience of creating, doing the surgery to be doing WASD, the controls for moving your character, and then firing with the space bar, because that's not going to be their experience in the surgery theater. So what you want to do instead is, there have been researchers experimenting with creating these rich video game simulated surgeries and actually having them being presented as VR or actual stereo 3D content to the trainees, and actually even having haptic feedback. So they actually will have like a little scalpel tool that they'll have to hold on to, and it'll be connected to a device. And I think I actually have a picture here. Oh, I didn't get a picture. The pen will be actually connected to a device, and they will have the pen have haptic feedback. So when they're cutting through the virtual tissue, they'll actually feel the feedback as they cut through the different fake tissues. And if they hit a bone, the fake scalpel will, stop. So you can actually create a really rich simulated surgery theater with stereo 3D and game engines. So there have been a lot of people out at Western and various other schools that have been working on creating these virtual reality or stereo 3D simulated surgeries. And I think that's really cool. So for stereo 3D and medical applications, training is a huge application. Another big application for stereo 3D in medical is this idea of depth assistance guidance. So a lot of surgeries these days are what's known as laparoscopic surgeries. And the idea is, instead of like doing some giant incision there and to remove something or perform something, they'll put like a teeny tiny hole in your armpit, and then they will send the tools through your body to the target location to perform the surgery at a distance, which means that they have to be able to guide the tools and the cameras through your body to the target site. And they're going to, if you've just got like a regular camera there, there's not going to, your ability to, run that camera through the body tissues is going to be kind of not so great. So people have been experimenting with doing either creating a depth map from the 2D image to help perform this guidance, or to simply actually send a stereo camera in if they can. So depth assistance guidance for things like laparoscopic surgeries is actually starting to be a big thing. Now, another place where we're seeing disparity and depth being used is actually in medical imaging. Now, one of the first places I've actually seen this done is actually with ultrasounds. So if you're having a baby, you have to have an ultrasound all the time. And if you're me, that means you have to have it like every week or every few days. And you can, now this is not medically required right now, but if you want, you can actually pay to get a 3D scan where they actually create a stereo image and a 3D model of your baby. It's kind of creepy looking because the technology is not so great right now. But you can imagine it this way. So this is a lung. So they've recreated from like an MRI or a CAT scan a 3D lung model. And what they want to do is, let's suppose that you want to be able to select a tumor or select a region of the tissue you've scanned, but obviously that tumor or that tissue isn't a flat 2D thing. So you want to actually be able to see it in 3D, but you also want to be able to select that problem location in 3D. And so using stereo 3D for medical imaging, the visualization and the selection is actually also starting to become a pretty big thing as well. So all of those things like 2D to 3D conversion algorithms, 3D selection algorithms, they are all being used in the medical industry to drive better technology. So that's actually pretty exciting if that's your area. Right. So there's a list of all of the different things. So we've got like tumor selection, estimating size and volume. So that's actually another interesting one. So just because you can select the tumor in 3D, so you've got to select, all around the tumor. Now we want to know what's the size, because I can tell you, like, when you have a tumor, and so I had cancer 7 years ago, when they were measuring the tumor, they didn't do anything other than what's the diameter of it. But that was the diameter as taken from an image pointing straight at me. And if they had had the ability at that time to actually take a 3D image of it, they could have not only looked at the diameter of it, they could have looked what is the exact size of it, what is a better estimation of the volume of this tumor, and it would have given them a better sense of how urgent things are and so on. So you can imagine this is actually a pretty interesting technology here, where you're taking S3D and using it to get a better sense of what's going on in the human body. Object removal. Maybe you want to look at what's behind something. So let's peel off, the rib cage so that we can look at the lungs better. How do we remove that 3D object of your ribs so that we can open it up and look underneath? There's some other topics that we've already been talking about is 3D object selection and removal. And now one of the interesting things that may take a lot of people by surprise is that stereo 3D stylization is actually important to medical applications. Now you might be wondering why. I mean, we're not going to be creating impressionist paintings, but things like toon shading, 3D line drawings, hatching, stippling in stereo 3D, that is important, because when you are trying to provide an image to someone to look at, sometimes medical images, if you've actually seen like an MRI or a CAT scan, they're actually really grainy. So you might want to do some kind of processing on that image to clean it up and make it more clear what you're looking at. Maybe that's for a diagram or some kind of analysis, but stylization does actually come into play for medical applications as well. So fun stuff, right? All right. Now, one of the other really big uses for stereo 3D is actually in autonomous vehicles. And I feel like that's kind of obvious. I mean, why do we need to have stereo 3D and the ability to estimate depth in an autonomous vehicle? Well, obviously, because we don't want to run into things. We want to be able to estimate how far away is the stop sign so that the car can correctly decelerate as it is approaching the stop sign, such that it is stopped at the stop sign. And we want to be able to do things like detecting how far in front of us is the person. Are we going to run into them? Do I need to slam the brakes on? So all of these different algorithms that we've been talking about are also very much useful for vehicles and robots and all those other things as well. So if you don't want to run over that, you need to be able to actually estimate the depth to do collision detection, collision avoidance. Now, how is this done in cars? So John kind of mentioned this, and I mean, every car is going to do this differently. A lot of cars are just doing this from a 2D camera. Now, even cars that are not autonomous in nature actually do kind of proximity detection as well. So I know I have a backup camera that I've installed on my car, and I mean, it doesn't tell you how far away things are, but it does like color the ground as like red, yellow, green. Anything in the red area is really close, danger. Yellow is you're getting close, and green is it's good. You're not going to hit it. And a lot of cars, their backup cameras do this. They colorize the back. And that's just a 2D camera. That is not a 3D camera. That's depth estimation done from 2D content, and it's not done very well. But they also have like cameras now to the side. Is a car getting too close to you on the side of you? And they have in front of you. Is somebody too close in front of you? My mother-in-law has one of these fancy Ford SUVs that will tell you like if anything is within reason, within this little box around the car. And it sort of works. It's also really annoying because I find like it can't tell the difference between something that matters and something that doesn't matter. It obviously doesn't do object detection. I also find that its estimation of how close things are may be off quite a bit. And again, it's because it's not really using a 3D camera. It's not computing a true disparity map. It's just a 2D camera that we're doing some estimation of depth on. Now, some vehicles, and especially autonomous vehicles, you want them to be able to do this better. And so there has been a use of LiDAR, which is a laser
based method for estimating how far away an object is. So a lot of these depth estimation algorithms are super important to autonomous vehicles. So if that's your interest, you can take these algorithms that you've learned about and now go off and improve them for vehicles. Maybe someday they'll invent an autonomous driving vehicle where you don't have to have a driver's license to actually own. And then I can own that vehicle because I don't have a driver's license. All right. So just so you know, what is LiDAR? That is a pulsed laser. So that is sending out a laser pulse, and it's a detector, and it knows the pulse that it's sent out. So it's using this detector to see how has that hit the different surfaces to estimate the shapes and scenes. Now, LiDAR is used for a lot of different things, by the way. We use LiDAR to estimate the speed of a vehicle. We use LiDAR to do depth scans. We also use LiDAR in the film industry to actually scan actors so that we can create accurate 3D representations of them. That's kind of a neat thing to see. All right. So just as kind of like an overview here of this whole section, what you should be, as you're reading these papers, you should be asking yourself, does stereo 3D actually improve the visual experience? Whether that's for film or TV shows or sports or video games, or if you're talking about simulating surgeries, are we actually creating a more engaging visual experience? Are we creating something that is worthwhile? Other things that we should be asking yourselves when you're reading the papers in this section is the stereo 3D actually improving success rates? So for medical training, are these simulated stereo 3D environments, are they actually improving the quality of the doctors? Are we getting people to learn how to do the surgeries better than the traditional methods? And how accurate are we with things like collision avoidance? So think about those questions as you're reading through the papers in this last section. And this last section probably contains a lot less math. So I know that the second section of the course has a lot of math. So if you've been a bit overwhelmed by that, this is a bit of a refreshing break from that. So this is, as I said, the last episode from me. I will again get back feedback for the last round of presentations. Don't forget to ask questions. And your project presentations, again, just post them to Piazza, but they're not due until sometime in August. And if you need anything from me whatsoever with respect to your project, help on paper access, content, just some general suggestions, please don't be afraid to reach out. It's really important to me more that we're able to work together to produce some quality research than for you to just struggle on your own. The other thing I wanted to mention is that if you're working on something new and you discover your idea doesn't work, that's okay. Discovering that something doesn't work is still valid research. So don't worry about that. All right, so that is the end of this episode, and I will see you on Piazza and by email. And if you need anything, again, please don't be afraid to let me know.